Mycenaean culture collapsed, Greece entered into a period where no written record exists. This would become known as the Greek Dark Ages, and it would last from about 1200 to 900 BCE. During this period, historians are entirely dependent upon archaeological records. Our historical records are circumspect at best because they're written centuries after the period. Nevertheless, they are valuable, and these sources shall frame our discussion. Chief among these written sources are the writings of Homer, which some scholars believe portray some elements of the Dark Ages, even though he was writing centuries after the Dark Ages. As they were written centuries later, they are often viewed as a combination of Dark Age and contemporary society, these depictions from Homer. Another source that we have are the writings of Homer's contemporary, a man named Hesiod. Together, Homer and Hesiod form the basis of the earliest literature coming out of Greece. This is roughly the 8th century. Homer was a Greek poet. According to Greek tradition, he was blind. And this is significant. Blindness in the Greek world had a special meaning and significance. Those who have read Oedipus Rex may remember Tiresias, the blind prophet. Blindness was associated with intelligence and prophecy. And Homer was blind. Homer is most remembered for writing 2 epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad describes the Trojan War. It discusses the origins of it and then picks up 10 years into the war. The Greeks, led by Agamemnon, waited outside the city of Troy, during which time the gods plagued the Greeks, before the Greeks then finally create the famous Trojan horse and take the city of Troy by deception. The central character of the Iliad is a man named Achilles, a demigod and the greatest fighter among men. He voluntarily goes to the Trojan War despite his mother foretelling that he would die young and be famous or live forever and be forgotten. By going to the Trojan War, Achilles makes a conscious choice to pursue fame at the risk of death. In the end, he was successful because we still speak of him today. For centuries, these stories in the Iliad were considered to be the works of fiction, entire fiction. In the 19th century, however, that view was challenged by one of the most important archaeologists of the modern world. His name was Heinrich Schliemann. He's born in 1822, dies in 1890. At great financial expense, and by putting his academic reputation on the line, Schliemann set upon his quest to prove that the Trojan War truly happened. And he actually was successful. He discovered the spread and influence of Mycenaean culture across the eastern Mediterranean. His work would lead to the identification of Troy's location in modern-day Turkey. Homer also wrote another work, which picks up where the Iliad leaves off. The Trojan War and the Odyssey is now over, and all the Greeks are returning. One man, a man named Odysseus, also called Ulysses, sets sail to return home to Ithaca, but he is plagued with a long and tangential journey in which the gods intervene in positive and negative ways. He meets various mythical creatures, such as the Cyclops and Sirens. When he finally manages to return home to Ithaca, he finds his wife being pursued by suitors, all of whom believe Odysseus to be dead. Odysseus is a little nervous about appearing on Ithaca after such a long absence and disguises himself as an old beggar. Penelope, Odysseus' wife, then creates a series of challenges for the suitors, including firing a strong bow through 12 axe heads. Each suitor fails, but Odysseus asks for a try. He manages to do it and then murders all of the suitors and is reunited with his wife. Happy story. Although this story is very entertaining, the Odyssey is a very significant work. The Odyssey paints a picture of the Greek gods and is often read alongside Hesiod's Theogony, discussed in a minute. The reason why the Odyssey is of particular importance is found in the portrayals of Greek law in action, Greek social hierarchies, and the importance of old age and prophecy and the role of women. Now, another contemporary of Homer's was a man named Hesiod, who has left us really 2 important works. The first one is a book called Works and Days, which I've mentioned in a previous lecture, and the other is a work called Theogony. Works and Days was a manual written for Hesiod's brother, Perses. It emphasizes the importance of manual labor and describes some agrarian methods. This work demonstrates the place of agriculture in the ancient world, both as with regards to its basis for the Greek economy and as a basis for humility. Now, as I've said in earlier lectures, in the ancient world, manual labor was the way in which people identified as being humble. And also, agriculture in particular has significance. I mentioned Cincinnatus, who, after serving in Roman offices, returned to his fields. Agriculture and farming was a respectable profession. Another work of Hesiod's is a work called Theogony, and this work is far more significant for historians and for contemporaries. Theogony is comparable to the Bible's Genesis and its creation story. Theogony details the origins and hierarchy of the Greek gods. It discusses their relationships and chronicles the salient myths of the Greek world. It cannot be overestimated or overstated how significant the works of Homer and Hesiod were to the people of ancient Greece. Some modern comparisons would be the significance of the Hebrew scriptures to the Jews and the Bible as a whole to the Christians. Homer's poems and the writings of Hesiod were both a historical account of the Greeks' past and a detailed account of their gods and the roles of these gods. Aristotle tells us that there was no poet before Homer, and Alexander the Great, we are told, kept a copy of Homer's Iliad with him as he went out and conquered the Persian Empire. But Alexander is not the only general or political leader to have a favorite book kept close to him as he slept. Those of you familiar with American history might recall a nice little anecdote about former President Richard Nixon. He was famed for keeping a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince next to his bedside. Someone could easily argue that this says a lot about his personality and political methods, and the same could be said of Alexander the Great by keeping the Iliad next to his bedside. Why did he keep a copy of the Iliad there? The reason is because he saw himself as a living Achilles, a demigod champion of man. The natural question a historian must ask him or herself is, do these sources represent accurately the world of Dark Age Greece, even though they were written centuries later, or are they depictions of Homer's lifetime being applied to an earlier time? The answer is complicated. The way historians have handled the issue is by describing the world presented as Homeric society. In other words, rather than addressing the problem head-on and coming up with a way to address these myriad of different views, historians have instead tried to come up with a consensus merely about what Homer's society portrays. So what do we see about Homeric society? The first thing that stands out from these works is the oral nature of the world they portray. Although the Iliad survives today in written form, it was passed down orally for years before this. Furthermore, it is describing a world centuries before it was written. In other words, it is describing an oral society. What is impressive is the size of the Iliad. And it's even more impressive when one considers that this work was memorized by many individuals. The length of epic poems is measured in lines, but this is sometimes hard to kind of fathom from a modern point of view. To paint a better picture of the Iliad's length, consider this. It is over 155,000 words long. 155,000 words. For comparison, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince is 168,000 words. Imagine memorizing that book, and at the risk of belittling the impressive nature of this feat, we live in a literate world. This means that the way we perceive narratives and structure them is markedly different from an oral society like Dark Age Greece. When one reads Homer and Hesiod, one comes away with many depictions of the ways in which Homeric society organized itself. Greece itself was divided into many demos, a Greek word that literally means people. Each demos would have cities, sometimes small, sometimes large, and farmland to support that city. In Book 2 of the Iliad, Homer gives us the entirety of the Greek army. He lists each demos, its leader, where it was located, and how many ships it brought to the siege at Troy. This is invaluable for historians. Each demos was led by a basileus, which literally translates to king. But the kings of ancient Greece were far different from the modern conception of a kingship. These were not powerful individuals who ruled over large swaths of territory. These are closer to, really, war chieftains, comparable to those who governed early medieval Ireland. Certain basileis, the plural of basileus, had more power than others, and would have been able to use that political capital to their advantage when interacting with other basileis. The basileus, the king, for a demos, oversaw the farmlands and smaller cities that surrounded the chief settlement where he resided, which was known as the polis, the physical structure, the city-state. We're going to talk about the polis in more detail in the following lecture, but for now, we need to understand that the polis and the demos were the two chief ways by which the people identified themselves in Homeric society. Throughout the Iliad, when two strangers meet, there are two ways the individual uses to define who they are. First is they inform the stranger the demos to which they belong. Next, they identify the polis, or basileus, under which their demos falls. So this demos is the way by which individuals would identify themselves. The position of the basileus was hereditary. In other words, it passed from father to son. But in a belligerent society like ancient Greece, heredity was not enough to secure positions of power. Remember, ancient Greece was first and foremost a warring society. It was a society in which poles frequently fought against one another and against outsiders. To be a strong leader, to be a strong basileus, one had to also be a warrior. In addition to this, one had to be able to convince his people that he was worthy of such a position. To do this, he also had to be a good public speaker. The status of each basileus in Homer's writings is determined by the number of men he can bring into battle. The greater number of men you had, the better warrior and public speaker you had to be. The number of men you could bring to war was directly dependent upon two things: your land and your ability to support those warriors. To support them, you had to feed and fund them. To do this, you would go to war, raid neighboring communities, and seize loot. This was then distributed amongst your warriors. A good basileus would continue to raid to sustain a large army, and thus increase his status. The reason the society was structured in this way is simple to explain, and it ties to how humans interact on a fundamental level across all of time and space. They are social. If you were born into a family of a certain demos, you would have spent most, if not all, of your life in that demos. The only time you would have left is when you went off to war. Your family would have married into various families across your demos, and possibly even a few neighboring demos under the same polis. Your friends would have been your neighbors. You would have worked your land alongside them working their land. You would have experienced economic hardships due to drought or plague alongside them. In other words, this thing called the human experience would have been jointly experienced as a community. That community was a demos. So, having said that, when it comes to identify yourself, you would have said, this is the community to which I belong. And in saying that, you are saying that this is who I am. These are my people. This is my demos. By providing this definition for identity, you are essentially saying, I can prove this is who I am because there are people who have known me in this community for the entirety of my life. In an illiterate society like that of the Homeric society, these social ties were paramount to your rights. You, as an ancient Greek person, only had rights in your demos or polis. The reason for this is, again, because of these human interactions and relationships. Within this demos were various households called oikos. Just as today, households had varying statuses, and wealth was dictated by one's standing in the demos and polis. In all, you have a rather structured hierarchy. At the top of this hierarchy was the identification of Greek people. They were so identified because they all spoke varying dialects of Greek. Underneath this were the powerful poles, at which a basileus was stationed. This polis oversaw varying demos of people, or people. Within each demos were varying oikos, or households. And so you have this very structured social hierarchy. Another thing I want to talk about is religion. Although Homer is describing the events of man, littered throughout his works are gods. They appear everywhere. This tells us several important things, especially when viewed alongside Hesiod's Theogony. Firstly, and most importantly, the Greeks viewed the gods as being ever involved in everyday life. They described them as being both benevolent and vindictive all at once. And these are qualities that all of the gods possess. If you rouse a god or goddess to anger, you, as a mortal, will grow to regret it. If you let a murder or some heinous crime go unpunished, the gods will curse your city. They will destroy your crops through bad weather and kill your people through plague and warfare. Ask yourself, why is this the case? Why do the Greeks describe their deities in such a way? Why do they describe them with such frequency? Well, put yourself in the world of the ancient Greeks. It is a world where science is beginning to emerge, but still in its infancy. The science that does exist is trying to do what science today does. It's trying to explain the world to make better sense of it. In the modern world, we understand that a season of bad crops can result from a myriad of factors, from bad weather to microscopic bacteria. This bad weather can be explained in further scientific terms, i.e. global warming, shifting weather patterns, long and short term, and the sheer randomness of the world's environment. These first explanations require comprehensive understanding of advanced science and meteorology. We have only begun to predict the arrival of hurricanes in the past century, and even then, we are still not very good at it. I can remember a time in 2005 when Hurricane Charlie was supposed to hit Louisiana, but instead hit Port Charlotte and Fort Myers at the last minute. Even though we understand what causes hurricanes to turn, we cannot predict their path accurately 100% of the time because of that third reason, the sheer randomness of our environment. What we perceive as randomness is more likely, and I have no evidence for this, a combination of factors that we cannot calculate simultaneously, but we are comfortable with this. Science does not ascribe a specific god's interaction with a hurricane to cause it to turn. We are comfortable with the fact that there is something at play that we don't understand. But these are all the ways in which we perceive the world. That's the way we perceive it. How would an ancient Greek perceive these events? To answer this question, let's return to this idea of randomness. The ancient Greeks hate it. They hate it. Things in the world are not random. They are ordained by a deity in a combination of fortune and fate. So, in a world in which you cannot describe events to sheer randomness or give some kind of complicated scientific explanation to, how do you explain them? The answer is quite simple. You have a god behind the action. How do you explain the wind in non-scientific terms? You can't. A common fallacy today is to look at the people of the ancient world and somehow view them as less intelligent than us. They knew less than us, sure. This can be certain, but they were no less intelligent, and they were no less curious. Mankind has always and will always be a fundamentally curious species. It has been the key to our survival. Tinkering and experimenting to find a better way to do something or an explanation of a certain event to understand it better, it is how we've survived and adapted to a myriad of negative events in human history. The people of ancient Greece were, like us, intelligent and curious. They wanted to know how the world worked, and they answered it in the best way they could, through religion. The reason the wind occurred isn't because of environmental factors, it's because a god pushes the air. We see this explained, for example, in Hesiod's Theogony. He says, "And from Typhoeus comes boisterous winds which bellow damply except Notus and Boreas and clear Zephyr. These are a God-sent kind, and a great blessing to men. But the others blow fitfully upon the seas. Some rush upon the misty sea and work great havoc among men with their evil, raging blasts. For varying with the season, they blow, scattering ships and destroying sailors. And men who meet upon the sea have no help against the mischief. Others again, over the boundless flowering earth, spoil their fair fields of men who dwell below, filling them with dust and cruel uproar." As we see, Hesiod himself ascribes a divine act behind bad winds. And this gets at another reason for religion being important. How do you explain bad things that happen in the world? If you've done everything right, you've planted your crops at the perfect time, you've made sure that you've received enough nutrients in the water, you've cared for them, how do you explain a spat of bad weather that causes them all to die? You lose all your crops. You can't. You can't explain that unless you ascribe it to a deity. If you do that, then you must ask yourself, what have you done to make that deity so mad? Once you do that, you must ask what you can do to make it right again. The answer is give a sacrifice. Sacrifice was the chief way people in ancient Greece tried to appease the gods. And as we look at various cities and cultures across the Greek world, we'll see that a large sum of temples were erected. So in conclusion, I want to just bring this to a quick end. What we've seen here is a Homeric society. It's a combination of post-Dark Age authors describing a Dark Age world, and what you get is a fictionalized and idealized account of the Greek past. But in this fiction, there is some truth. The Trojan War really did happen. Troy really was a city in Turkey. And through these works, we see certain elements of society become highlighted, specifically the gods. So when we look at these works of Homer and Hesiod, let's not look at them as these pure works of fiction. Let's don our historian goggles and look at them as historical works. Not works that are necessarily historically accurate, but works that were written by people to describe their society, if even in indirect ways.